And then I did want to note in terms of background, and I'll let Tarek introduce himself as well. But we come from the managed care world, and a lot of our experience actually is rooted in 3 very different business lines. So for any questions kind of regarding quality and Medicaid and our commercial, I'm happy to chime in on those. And then Tarek, you have a lot of experience in Medicare Advantage, so a lot of those questions can be directed at you. But given the amount of content we have, I'll say let's just get started. So my name is Demi, and I am the CEO of Acros Advisory. We help companies with go-to-market strategy for managed care and payers in particular. So we're excited to host another one of our monthly workshops where we focus on very practical and tactical insights for founders and our builders who are trying to change the payer landscape, as payers are one of the main mechanisms, right, that our health system works here in the US. So today I'm super excited that we have an expert on HEDIS and Stars and quality metrics for payers with us. So Tarek, I'd love it if you share a little bit about you.
Thank you, Demi. Yeah, as Demi said, my name is Tarek Marei, and I spent about 3 years working with the UHC Medicare finance teams, specifically focused on stars and quality. So, I'm here to kind of give a little bit of background on what I learned on how that impacts budgets and how, from the perspective of a startup, you may want to approach trying to wedge into those budgets and things like that. So I will be providing any expertise I have. I haven't been referred to as an expert before, so I like that.
Awesome. Well, we're grateful to have you. So in terms of objectives for today, the goal for the presentation today is really to help you primarily understand the economics of quality when it comes to quality measures, and Medicare Advantage. We'll also be using some examples from Medicaid as well. And then we do want to help you figure out how to better position your solution inside of a payer's budget, and specifically their quality budget. So we'll be sharing some insights about different budget pockets and how to access them. And then we'll share some insights around how you navigate internal decision-making and procurement realities within managed care organizations, and then some pro tips around aligning your strategy, as well as the timing and when to approach partnerships, especially if you're selling to Medicare Advantage or Medicaid, and then what that looks like. So that's on it for today. Why are we here? I would say I feel like every year we used to have changes, and then it was every month, and now I feel like every week there's some new change happening in the world of managed care. And so today we are really here because there's been one very big announcement, and that was the CMS advance notice. So if we think historically about how do we get payer contracts, if we advance to the next slide, we can see that the two primary routes historically have been for companies that are MLR eligible, and or companies that focus on what we call SG&A. And we are going to spend some time kind of defining that, but I'm curious, Tarek, how would you define the SG&A bucket, and how would you define and or distinguish the MLR eligible bucket?
Yeah. So we'll get deeper into that, in a few slides, but basically the way I think about it is SG&A buckets, they are not specifically tied or directly tied to medical costs, and you're going to have more opportunity for larger margins and a lot more flexibility on what your product can be. But the downside is the size of the budget within the whole P&L is much smaller than a MLR eligible solution. So you'll have less regulatory constraints, you'll have less hoops you need to jump through, maybe, so to speak. But you have constraints and a lot more competition from other vendors as well. So I think there's kind of pros and cons of each.
Yeah, and we'll map that out even deeper in the next few slides here. But I did want to note, so with the advance notice, I guess the kind of main signal that we're getting is that CMS is really tightening the risk score inflation, or upcoding, I guess, as we like to call it in the industry, the various pathways to doing that. So there's the recalibration of the different kind of weights and or the changes that are happening, the level of scrutiny that is going to be a part of this assessment process is increasing. And so plans are, I would say, increasingly worried about coding compliance. They're increasingly worried about encounter data integrity and just documentation defensibility as they have to complete CMS audits going forward. And so vendors that depend on chart reviews or sort of sell coding uplift without really any, not any, but just limited compliance guardrails, or lean on kind of retrospective revenue capture will likely face much harder evaluation and more legal review and scrutiny. So with that in mind, if we flip to the next slide, we can see the kind of biggest change is the SG&A bucket, which a lot of startups have used to being able to access pretty freely in the past. And again, even though it's a much smaller budget, overall that budget is now being decreased, and then the level of scrutiny is actually also increasing. So that's becoming more and more difficult space for startups to access in terms of vendor partnerships and relationships with payers. But I'm curious, Tarek, what other thoughts you may have on this?
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think the biggest impact of the rate notice is that SG&A bucket that, you might have had more product flexibility to wedge in with a payer is going to be decreasing, as the whole pie decreases, the SG&A gets hit first, because there's a lot of fixed costs within SG&A. That's where workforce costs and all those different things hit. So, there's not a lot of flexibility from payers on that perspective. And so what gets cut first is, kind of the maybe nicer to have solutions that, payers might be taking a chance on. And then I think with the regulatory scrutiny increasing due to the rate notice, that's not necessarily due to CMS changing anything or the regulatory constraints changing. It's more so just related to competition. So with increased competition, the payers will be looking at the solutions with maybe a little bit more detail, and that could lead to more regulatory scrutiny from a payer themselves rather than what they need to do to comply with CMS.
Great, thank you. So with that in mind, how do you as a startup founder, as a vendor, choose the right budget to plug into? We are going to cover a few different options. And then also one highlight that we wanted to talk about today, and this is where the bulk of the presentation will focus on, is an alternative pathway that both Tarek and I have noticed, which we are calling the hybrid route. And the hybrid route is really a combination of a solution that is MLR eligible and can plug into that budget, but then also expand into SG&A budget as well. So we were talking about a route to market that is really leveraging the strengths and the ease with which you could access a very large budget within the MLR scope, but then also expand and grow and take on more and more responsibilities within the health plan via SG&A type activities. But Tarek, did you want to share anything about this hybrid strategy?
Yeah, I think the hybrid strategy is a really unique way of wedging into a payer, because I think, as we'll talk about on the next slide, with the pros and cons of going the MLR route or going what I would call like the non-MLR or SG&A route, the hybrid allows you to benefit from both, more or less. And so what I've seen is it's a lot easier to wedge into a payer using an MLR solution. You have a lot more dollars to work with, and if you can pass those regulatory hurdles, then you've kind of proved yourself to the payer. You kind of pass the highest hurdles, and you can get a spot on the budget, and then from there you can start to build out an SG&A solution, whether it's analytical based or something like that, that you can drive more margins, you have more product flexibility. And then from there, you have a wider product suite that you're working with the payer on. Keeps you a little bit stickier with the payer, and hopefully, creates more predictable and diversified revenue streams.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the main thing I wanted to note here is that there is really no wrong way to explore and or build payer contracts or focus them. You can access all three, right? It's just that we wanted to make sure that you're aware of the pros and cons of each different route. And as you're building, especially if you're still in that sort of early stage and you're still trying to prove product market fit, there may still be an opportunity from a product perspective for you to change the product in a meaningful way that allows you to access a much bigger budget and that allows you to go to market much faster and or even fundraise a lot more dollars, because now you're opening up a much bigger TAM for yourself. And this is where, when we work with founders, the earlier we work and the earlier we talk about the commercial opportunity and figure out the path to market, and whether there's reimbursement or not, and or what the different pathways are, you can end up with a completely different product than what you were sort of initially envisioning, because now you're solving a very different kind of problem with the solution that you have. So here we're sort of trying to capture and unpack each different path and how it's different and or similar. And so one of the main things that I wanted to call out here is that if you are a solution that is MLR eligible, and we're going to spend a little bit really, again, talking about what MLR is, and we have a whole nother workshop on that topic, but it does require very heavy documentation. It has to be able to withstand a CMS audit, and potentially you're signing up for lower margins. But again, on the flip side, the pros are that you are accessing a much larger budget, and potentially you may be able to shorten that the timeline to contract, and then also you're bypassing finance potentially. So then you are the number of vetoes is reduced, and so therefore you're getting to decision faster from a sales perspective. Anything else to add on MLR?
No, I don't think so. The one thing I might add on the MLR is, if for those that are curious of why the margins are lower for MLR-based solutions, a lot of that has to do with, typically the clinical solutions that you're adding into a Medicare Advantage plan are going to be benchmarked to what CMS has posted, and that's related to the bid. And so there's a lot less flexibility as far as margins you can negotiate, whereas, with the SG&A solution, which we'll see in a second, you can probably lean closer towards getting more of like a SaaS margin, so to speak, because there's a lot less regulatory constraints and a lot more flexibility and a lot more negotiating room for that. So
great. And then yes, for SG&A, I guess the biggest thing here is that you're going to have a lot more fierce competition, especially I think now. I think that one of the other really big market changes that's affecting SG&A is AI, and just the fact that now it feels like anybody can build a solution and or a tool and try to take it to market. And so there's so much noise and there's even more competition, even though the true competition may still be pretty similar to before, but it just seems like there's so many solutions out there, a lot, worse than others and a lot better than others. But, that's why I think it's important to also really think about the hybrid strategy, because the more you can prove that you are a true solution and you've thought this through, and you have a clear, product definition, and it's informed not only by administrative but also clinical strategy, I think that's where a lot of folks are going to get more attention from peer leadership. Anything else to add on SG&A or hybrid?
No, I don't think so. Well, I guess a few things. So on the finance piece, just as as a finance guy, I should point out, we don't have the power to just veto a solution because we don't like it. What that will typically look like is, you might be competing with 3 other vendors doing 3 different things, and finance will go back to the business and say, okay, if this is going to be an SG&A solution, you got to pick one. And so it's more so just, kind of forcing the business to make a decision of what do you need to have in this situation versus what is a nice to have solution. I think the other thing, there's one other thing I was going to say, I lost it. But moving on to the hybrid, I think the hybrid solution really is a phenomenal path to choose. It gives you so many options as a company. I think that the major downside, which we pointed out, is the operational complexity, building out multiple different product lines and making sure they're all compliant with the various regulatory constraints of MLR or SG&A. Could be a little bit difficult. I think the one other point I would make out is, Demi, you touched on AI, and I'm sure this will change, but right now, almost every AI solution is still considered not MLR eligible. It's just, I think it's so new that it's hard to prove the MLR eligibility so far. And so obviously there's a lot of competition in that space right now. There's companies popping up left and right. And so for the time being, you're pretty much competing over the same bucket, which is the smaller of the 2 buckets. Now, 2, 3, 5 years from now, that could change. We could be able to prove MLR eligibility on AI solutions, and that changes the story completely. But for now, I think you're going to face even more increased competition due to the spike in AI solutions.
Awesome. For those of you that are on a call wondering what is MLR, I've never heard that, and we love acronyms in healthcare. I would highly encourage you to watch. We have a workshop that really dives deep into MLR and what it is, and how do you access it. But I think one dynamic that I wanted to share about the medical loss ratio is that's typically set by policy. So health plans are held accountable by federal and or state government around different medical loss ratios. And so they're limited in terms of how they can spend dollars. And so MLR is basically saying, hey, health plan, you can't have record profits and just keep that for yourself. Your dollars have to primarily be spent on clinical spend. And then some of that you can keep and spend on administrative things. And then some of that for public payers, I guess, you can keep as and record as profit. So that is kind of the high level macro function of MLR. But again, highly encourage you to tune into that workshop if you're interested in learning more about that topic. But Tarek, I was curious if we go to the next slide for you to dive deep into an example of like what a health plan executive looks at when making some of these decisions, and how do the dollars look, and what do they have to play with?
Yeah, I think this chart's really interesting because it shows the benefit of the STARS bonuses that we're going to discuss later in this presentation. As you can see, the medical line is the bulk of the costs that are being put into a bid, and then the SG&A group is way smaller. And so if you look at the STARS rating from, like, let's say 3.5 to 4, the STARS bonus just ends up being an added premium that the government is paying back to the insurer, and that they can use to work with. And so that has more of an impact on SG&A than it would on medical. It does have, it means a plan can add more benefits on the medical side and have more offerings for their customer, which is nice to have, but then it gives them more flexibility from an SG&A perspective as well. Let's see. I think that's kind of all I had on here. We can dive a little deeper into that in a second.
Yeah, so the next few slides we wanted to show you and share some case studies. And so this first one is accessing the MLR bucket dollars. So Tarek, did you want to share something about this one?
Yeah, I think this is just a good, clean example of a company that entered into the budget through an MLR solution and stayed that way. They were doing in-home risk assessments for Medicare Advantage members. So obviously that counts as MLR, as it's, directly clinical, and it's addressing various gaps within the stars ratings. And they started, narrow, and they sold to the risk teams. And so basically what their sales pitch is they're protecting the revenue that a payer was already earning. So, or adding more revenue for lower rated stars plans. So I think, one way to look at that is if the regulatory constraints were to change, if the measures are to change a little bit, and you have a 4 or 5 rated stars plan, a company could come in and say, hey, we think this is going to hurt your stars rating in the future. Our solution will help you protect it, help you close more gaps that might be more difficult to fill moving forward. And so what they did, and then they expanded nationally after, wedging their way in, and they were eventually acquired, which is one of the strategies we will discuss later. Yeah, like I said, they are MLR eligible just because they are directly clinical. So
I think one of the things I wanted to note here is that, why did this work is that from the health plan decision-making perspective, there's direct top-line impact. I mean, when we talk about quality dollars, we're talking about millions of dollars, especially for those bigger national plans, in direct revenue. We're also talking about just high urgency in terms of the need for a solution that will help with closure of care gaps. And again, a lot of that urgency is because there is top-line impact. And then also they've crossed their T's and dotted their I's and making sure that they're audit defensible. And so it just kind of makes it like a no-brainer of like, okay, great. We have a solution that's solving a real problem for us that's urgent, and it's going to help drive revenue on our end as a health plan. So that's kind of my 2 cents on why this worked.
Yeah, and then here we have an example that went a different route. It went in as an SG&A solution. So this is kind of what I was referring to with those AI solutions. Typically not going to be considered MLR related. They're not directly tied to clinical outcomes. Now they're still helpful for payers in identifying gaps, and it helps them direct their clinical tools into the right areas. So in this case, you're going to be selling more to a finance team or a risk operations team, and you're going to need to show like a clear ROI of revenue capture, so to speak. And there's a bunch of different ways where you can do that. You can say this is going to protect you from hiring extra FTEs in the future. It's going to be more efficient than the vendor you had before. Kind of more standard sales pitches, so to speak. And this was another company that did eventually get acquired by Optum. And this is, I think, a pretty common route where if you're a company that your goal is to be acquired by a large service arm of a payer, this is a good route to go, because you would be building something that the service arm would need to be building in the future, and that can be appealing to the payers depending on the agreements you guys have. So.
And yeah, my 2 cents on this is, again, there's top line impact. And then also, I guess what works in their favor, being in the SG&A bucket, there really is no audit requirement. So you don't really need to pay attention to that. But again, the fact that they built a solution that, and we'll talk about it actually, every payer goes through a very sophisticated kind of build by partner decision. I think Apixia really intelligently navigated that and sort of initiated themselves into a relationship with United and later Optum. So we'll unpack that. So what is the hybrid strategy? What are really the steps? What we're calling hybrid or wedge strategy is really you're entering as a clinical quality solution that enables you to plug into a much larger budget. You're MLR eligible. And then the goal for you then is to prove your impact and then expand into analytical tooling workflow type work, which is then opening up the SG&A bucket for you. Where I'm going to spend the bulk of the time is really talking about, if we can just go back one slide, we'll unpack how do you actually enter as a clinical quality solution shortly. So Before that, though, we want to talk about the hybrid and wedge strategy and specifically highlight a case of a company that was able to use this wedge strategy. So, Tarek, I'll let you take us through this one.
That's great. Yeah, so Amada was a very interesting example. They had a diabetes prevention program that they used to offer a clinical solution to payers, and they started really small. They started, with a very specific demographic in these health plans targeting, I think that the diabetes applies to 3 or 4 of the measures. So you're not, it's narrow enough that a service arm wouldn't necessarily want to build something out. And, they took the risk on their end and the operational complexity, and built it out. They were selling to the medical and quality teams rather than IT. And then this led to, successful clinical outcomes. They had high engagement rates. Payers saw they had cost avoidance, and this kept them from having a lot of direct competition, both from service arms and from other companies that maybe didn't have a solution that was MLR eligible. And so that's how they got in. They wedged in with the MLR eligibility, and then, as you'll see later, they scaled that solution kind of horizontally across health plans, but then they also were able to tack on SG&A related solutions that could improve their margins and also give them more product offerings to the same payer, and allow them to be a better partner and stickier in that budget, so to speak.
Yeah, so ultimately, if you go to the next slide, it's up to you to decide, which path do you want to pursue. I think there are a few critical questions you need to answer as a founder. What margins? Are you okay with lower margins? Are you comfortable with audit scrutiny? What how does that look like? Are you able to and comfortable to operationalize that when needed? So, without further ado, what does the hybrid wedge strategy look like in reality? So we'll walk you through a case with a company that we've taken through the strategy, and really, it kind of boils down to 3 key steps. So first, you need to decide as a founder, what can you move? What can you actually impact? Then step 2 is identify who the weakest performers are in that particular metric, and then from there you get very targeted, and you have your messaging, and then you just you go for it, you execute. So that's really the sales piece of it. But you need to do step 1 and step 2 in order for you to effectively do step 3. What I often see is sort of founders doing this sort of like spray and pray approach of like, well, I'm just going to talk to everybody. But then you're talking to a payer who's, doing fantastic in a particular measure. And so they're like, why? We don't need to have this conversation. And then there's, 50 more that are really struggling and could definitely use your help. So it's all about streamlining and targeting and aligning who you're selling to. So what does this look like? A few things to unpack. So, this is a very big space. So today is not meant to be educational in terms of educating you on like what STARS is, or what CAPS is, or what HEDIS is, or what HOS is. And there's so many acronyms, right? Today is really meant to give you the strategy. And then if any of you are curious and want more detail, we're happy to jump on a call with you afterwards. But just high level set around STARS. It's really a quality rating system. When it comes to HEDIS and CAPS, CAPS is a survey that then feeds into HEDIS, that then feeds into overall STARS metrics. HEDIS are standardized quality measures and metrics that are often underlying the ultimate sort of STARS calculation. And then STARS, depending on if you're looking at it from Medicaid, commercial, or Medicare Advantage perspective, for example, are used as a way for a member to actually decide which health plan do they want to be participating in. And so it is a huge impact to to revenue for health plans, and also for perception in the marketplace of like how well a health plan is performing or not performing. And it can really lead to, if you're below 3 stars on any of the measures, it could really dissuade people from joining your health plan, and or paying for that. So it's important to kind of have that background. Key things to think about stars and quality scoring is that think about how the measures are organized. So there's different measures that measure different things, like member experience and service is a big category. And so CAPS feeds into that. There's also pharmacy and Part D behaviors, such as medication adherence, refills, things like that. There's a whole other category that targets specifically screenings, chronic care, preventative care, and we typically call that clinical care gaps. So there's different categories of measures and metrics that ultimately kind of boil up to a specific measure. Again, this is thousands of people work in the space. This is very, very high level today that we're able to go into what stars are and what the different measures are. But what I wanted to mention is, as you're thinking about the metrics, as a founder, you really need to focus on and define what can you move. What measures can you actually improve? So one of the first things that we do with our clients is always look at their solution and map to different measures to really understand, okay, are you a maternal health solution? And so which metrics can you impact? Are you a social determinants of health solution? Are you a pharmaceutical solution? And so from there, we're able to map out, from a clinical quality perspective, where do you fit in? And then one thing to note is that there are different measures for the different kind of populations. So if you're focused on Medicaid or Medicare commercial, there's going to be different set of measures. And also there's different weights for different measures as well. So you can see I've highlighted here some examples where a measure could be a weight of 2 or a weight of 1 or a weight of 5. And so we always want to identify those heavily weighted measures, as that means that's where the very big impact, dollar impact, is going to be. The other thing that I wanted to call out here too is just the different timelines. So you'll see here that there is a lag between when measures are measured, when measures are like reported, and when payments are actually made out from the government back to the health plans. Tarek will go into that timeline in a few slides here, but that's going to be really important to also think through. So key takeaway from this slide that I just wanted to leave with you is, focus on the heavyweights, identify the measures that you can materially improve with your solution, and then measures will vary by population, Medicaid, Medicare, commercial. Go ahead.
And one thing I wanted to hop in, sorry to cut you off there. This is a really important thing to keep track of, because the weights change from year to year. So let's say your solution is diabetic. We can continue the example of Amada, and they changed the weighting on the diabetic measures and brought them up to a 4, because basically, I think the way I understand it is CMS uses these measures as a way of like pulling levers on the Medicare population. And if they notice there's an issue, they want to fix it, they will try to wait and incentivize the payers to focus more on, it could be diabetics, could be breast cancer screening, could be improving medication refills, things like that. So that's an opportunity where, if your solution is something that's low weighted, and then the next year the weightings change, that's a way you could go to a payer and say, hey, the weighting just changed on this. We're really good at this. We can help you protect the revenue of this stars plan that was 4.5 stars, but maybe you're not prepared to adjust for the new weighting. And that could be a way of approaching a payer.
Thank you. That's super, super helpful. I was going to let you kind of go wild in this in this slide and sort of talk about just the different. I mean, you can see here the sort of breadth and the depth of some of these measures, but any ones that you wanted to comment on?
No, I won't bore you with specific measure talk, but I really like this graph. I know it's a little bit old, and I think some of the measures have changed, but it does show you kind of the breakdown of, HEDIS is generally going to be more of the clinical related work that is non-pharmaceutical, and then the surveys are more customer satisfaction, customer engagement, and provider satisfaction. So I think the HEDIS part is interesting, because that's where payers are incentivizing both the patients and the providers to keep them healthy. So make sure they're going to the doctor, make sure they're getting, a screening for all sorts of different things. And they, have benefits built in that if they check those boxes, they get a reward, essentially. So yeah, I think this is a really interesting screen to look at, and probably more detail than people want me to get into right now.
Sounds great. So where do you find this information? Is a question that I get often, and so a lot of this information is publicly available, and so you could find data on the CMS website. You can find data on the NCQA. The NCQA site, there's literally health plan scorecards that you can access. And what I love about that too is because it tells you too if a health plan is accredited or not accredited. Also, it will tell you if they have health equity accreditation or not. And so by having access to this information, you're able to identify which health plans to really target and you're in alignment with or not in alignment with. So if we go to the next slide, is key thing I wanted to share here is that if a health plan is really strong in a particular measure, they're likely not going to be adding a point solution, which kind of brings me to the next point, which is you should be using all of the data that's at your disposal to really identify which health plans are weakest performers and where they're the weakest performers in. So if step one is for you to really define where you can make impact, step two is going to be for you to identify those weak performers. So if we go to the next slide, here's an example of a company that built a solution in the social determinants of health space. And what they traditionally would have been considered to be coming out of the SG&A budget. And we worked with them to really identify, hey, actually, by virtue of your solution, you're able to impact immunization scores, you're able to impact postpartum care scores. And then we were able to identify, okay, which health plans are underperforming in those measures, and then be able to have really targeted conversations with those health plans, and then accelerate sales significantly in those states and with those health plans. And you can also look at sort of public health data to just narrow down which states you want to focus on. And then once you have the list of states that, here we have a map of the US and we looked at where are there maternal care deserts. That was a great indicator on which states we should be focusing on. And typically that's where we see a lot of health plans struggling with those measures. And the other kicker is, so this is a Medicaid example, not a Medicare Advantage example, but oftentimes the state in their request for proposals to the health plans will oftentimes, require or have questions around like, how are you going to improve immunizations? Because again, the goal of the state is to manage the population's health, and then the goal of the health plan is to show that they can manage population health for that state. And so it's really helpful for you to look at population health data, identify where those gaps are, and then see which health plans are doing performing well or not performing well, and then that way target them for potential partnership, pilot, or sales conversations. So, I think where the rubber meets the road is that digital health solutions don't really stall because they don't work. A lot of founders build really great solutions. Oftentimes they stall, and the conversations for product market fit or sales or pilots can't even happen is because they haven't done the work and they don't understand the business of health plans and or managed care, and how health plans actually measure quality and how significantly that impacts their budget. And so that was critical to kind of organizing and having this workshop today, is to really help founders understand what they need to focus on, and really tailor their solutions to that. Tarek, any thoughts on this one?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think this kind of hits it on the head. Basically, you need to prove to the payer why your solution is, clearly better than what they're doing now, and why it's going to pay for itself essentially. So, you got to take the operational risk off of them, the financial risk off of them. That's going to get you in the room, and then from there you can build it out. So,
great. So to get really granular, with this particular solution that focuses on social determinants of health, they help connect mothers to very much needed childcare. And so with that access, then they're able to, we help them map out KPIs that then map out to the different measures. So we identified, okay, with the solution that you have, you're able to boost PPC scores, you're able to boost well-child visits, and then the KPIs then that we said, let's track the percent supported moms that complete their visits. So that has direct impact to that measure. It has direct impact to the top line of the health plan. Same thing with well-child visits. So how do we improve that measure? Okay, we're supporting children in completing their required visits. So this is really important actually for moms with 2 or more children. When they have access to childcare, they're actually able to take care of each child much better, and are able to go to the visits that are required, and then close those gaps in care. And same thing with immunizations. And so this is the work. And this, we shared this with a few potential health plans, and with this particular client, we're able to lock in sales within 3 months, just because we made it so clear to the health plan, here's how we're going to create value for you with the solution, and then map it out with the specific KPIs and measures for the plan. All right. I want to pause here. So before we go into the next section and see if there's any questions in the chat or any questions on what we've covered. All right. Well, we're going to get into some pro tips then. Everything is clear as mud. Tarek, you were really big on this one. So I'll let you take this. But why does timing matter? And what does timing actually even mean?
Yeah, timing is important. So all payers submit a bid to CMS for their Medicare plans over a year in advance. So if you are trying to get in, like specifically if you're an MLR solution, because MLR solutions typically, the MLR dollars tend to be finalized in the bid, and there's a little bit more flexibility with the SG&A budget. But if you're providing a clinical solution, you want to get at a budget for a payer, you probably need to be starting those conversations with them, 12 to 18 months before the actual work is going to start being done, just due to the bid cycle and due to how much work they're putting in before the bid cycle, which is ultimately due in June every year. So typically, payers will start looking at the bid the beginning of the year, and then they adjust their assumptions based on the advance rate notice and then the final rate notice, which comes out in April, and then it really kicks into high gear, and they're finalizing exactly every dollar they're going to spend. Essentially, they're telling CMS. Then that sets what premium CMS is going to pay out to all the payers, and that sets everyone up for the next Medicare year. So
in the next couple of slides, we share a little bit of that timeline, so you can definitely spend some time looking at it. But I think the key takeaway here is that Medicare Advantage economics really operate on this like 2-3 year lag. And again, the measurement year is not the payment year, or the bid year is not the performance year. So there is a lag to impact that should be accounted for when you're sort of pitching. So if we think about the timeline, I would say if you are pitching a solution to Medicare Advantage, best time to engage would be kind of 9 to 15 months before the bid submission. And then I would say that, ideally it would be before like advance notice is like finalized, even though there is some important information that needs to be paid attention to in those advance notices. But I would say if you show up after the June bid, you're likely going to be waiting another 12 months before you can really initiate conversations. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think if we talked about the most recent advance notice, which I think was a little bit surprising to most people in the industry as to how low of an increase it was. If you see that and you wanted to react to that, you're probably looking at influencing not this coming STARS year, but the year after that. So you'd be influencing 2028. I do think it's also interesting to pay attention to the final rate notice, which is typically released in early April. That could easily change this advance rate notice increase amount. I think there's typically, the way I understand it, I'm sure there's payers and the government are negotiating like crazy right now, trying to figure out what the right increase is. And so, if you had an SG&A solution and the rate notice comes out and you're like, damn, I'm not going to be able to get in a budget, that could change, and your environment could change completely in 2 months. So it's something to keep an eye on for sure.
The other thing I wanted to note on this, and now we're shifting to Medicaid, is that most states operate on a 3 to 5 year cycle, and the request for proposal cycles are driven by the state. So in Medicare Advantage, you have the federal government and their timeline. In Medicaid, you have the state timelines and RFP cycles, and so that budget really depends on the state RFP cycle. So best time would be 12 to 18 months kind of before that contract rebid, is to initiate conversations with the various health plans. And having worked in that space, there's like literally whole teams dedicated to the like rebid process that are scanning for solutions that it can include in those bids back to the state. So there are teams like proactively looking for social determinants of health or maternal health or whatever solutions they may be looking at, or problems they're looking at solving at the population health level in a given state. And then for commercial, you're looking at annual kind of budgeting. So there's a little bit more flexibility. There's no kind of CMS or state kind of bid or rebid cycle. So it's a totally different world.
And one other thing I'd add is, if you were curious, like, okay, how does my solution fit into the bid? I mean, you're never going to find like a filled out bid online because payers keep those pretty close to the vest. It's highly competitive between them, but there are like the bid itself is available on CMS. So you can pull it up and you can look through it, and you can kind of see what the payers are looking at and what the payers are filling out when they're submitting this to CMS, and get a pretty good idea of where your solution is going to fit and how that can impact the finances of the payer. So just something to keep in mind.
This is something I always say is always pay attention to your customer's customer. And so when we talk about Medicaid, the state is your customer's customer. When we talk about Medicare, federal government is your customer's customer. So that's what really is going to affect things. So another big pro tip. So again, let's say you've done everything right. You're following the hybrid strategy. You've identified your metrics, and then, biggest kind of hurdle to think through is the timing. I would say the next biggest hurdle then to think through is this sort of build by partner question. Like I mentioned, a lot of the payer organizations have teams dedicated to scanning the market and identifying solutions that they want to partner with as they're sort of going to rebid or sort of position themselves for success and solving for some of these gaps in care that they may have. So we wanted to, think through, okay, how do we help our founders understand how to navigate the build by partner conversation with a payer, and how does a payer think when they're making a decision of like, hey, let's say I'm United Healthcare, I'm just going to have Optum build this, or no, actually I want to buy a solution that exists in the market, or I'm going to partner with someone as a vendor. So Tarek, maybe tell me the highlights of your experience of like, how does a payer make a decision like that? And we have some examples here on the slide.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're trying to get around the service arm, you need to think about like what would they not want to build out? There's a bunch of different reasons why they wouldn't want to build it out. If you're investing in an internal solution and dedicating headcount to it and budget dollars to it over a long period of time, like that's a risk. And if that doesn't work out, that's whoever makes that decision has to wear that for their career. Whereas, if it's kind of more of a niche solution, and they can go out and run a pilot with, a startup, say it doesn't work, they can just say, hey, we tried a pilot, it didn't work, no skin off my back. And if it does work, then, that's a whole different conversation. That's where we get into the buy or partner situation. And so I think that's kind of the way to think about it is you got to find the niche that, an Optum or a service arm at any of these other big payers is not going to want to invest significant resources in right away. And that's where I think you saw with Omada, and a few of the other case studies we showed, they find a little narrow solution and they wedge themselves into a payer, and then they can scale that solution across, multiple health plans. It's still narrow. It's still probably not quite worth a service arm's time to build that out. And maybe they eventually do, and then either acquiring you or you're partnering with them moving forward. So
I think when we were chatting through this slide, we said, you to be successful right now, you probably would want to work with the service arm, like make them your friend, and to make them your friend. I would say one of the biggest things that I've seen is like take on the risk, take on the failure. Like just, externalize that for them. And then they're going to be a lot more willing to work with you. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think what I've seen is the vendors that have lost business, in my time, are the ones that try to replace a service arm. You're never going to replace the internal service arm. There's all sorts of market dynamics as to why the big payer is going to want to go with their service arm because, it's cheaper for them, it's more efficient, it's a whole bunch of different things. But if you partner with them and you say, okay, let's say, we can use Optum, for example. Let's say Optum does 80% of this process. We'll fill in that 20% gap and we'll do that for you. We'll partner with Optum and we'll work with them. The payers, they're going to light up. They're going to be like, this is great. This last piece that we wanted to build out, it just didn't really make sense, economically for us internally. We can go pay someone a fee to do it. All of a sudden they, have improved their output that way. So.
Yeah. Own the operational kind of execution and really be hard to replicate, I would say, and avoid kind of threatening some of like the core teams or core functions would be key kind of takeaways or guidance from my experience. And we'll skip through. I mean, we've already talked about Omada. You mentioned it. Why they were successful. I would say how to work through the internal build objection, again, is just you're much quicker as a startup. You're much more flexible. You're nimble. You're able to have a faster time to impact. And then typically you're able to operate at a much lower cost. You require less staff. You just get things done faster. So that's really where you kind of can win and lead with. And then, really using your unique expertise. I would recommend, because we're running up close here on top of the hour, we do have some workshops for you to really understand additional layers of payer decision making. And one of the biggest one is really the distinction of what's a hard versus a soft benefit. And this touches on ROI. I think with all these changes that we're seeing, and again, the increased competitions with more and more AI solutions, ROI is going to be an even bigger part of the conversation. And so definitely go get smart on that as you are kind of thinking through building and navigating payer land. And then we also cover in that particular workshop, we talk about attribution. I think that's where one of the big failure points in my experience is there's so many point solutions now, especially at the big national payers, where it's really hard to say, okay, this, especially in the Medicare Advantage population where you've got multiple comorbidities and you've got multiple kind of solutions deployed at that population. How do we know that it's solution A and not solution B and not solution C that's really creating that impact? And so it's important for you to be really thoughtful about how you're going to measure ROI and how you're going to navigate the attribution question that is mostly going to come from the Medicon and actuarial teams on the health plan side. Yeah. And then Tarek, you had some thoughts around exit strategy.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the idea, you probably want to know what your exit strategy, what your ideal exit strategy is before you even enter a relationship with a payer, because I think it'll impact how you go about your relationship with them. So, you know, if you're comfortable being acquired, or if that's your goal, then, you know, you can probably build out something that a service arm would normally build out, and you just do it faster, and then you do it well and they acquire you. If you want to stay independent, you're going to want to stay narrow, you're going to want to scale horizontally, and you're going to want to diversify your customer base to make sure you're driving enough business. So I think that's just something to keep in mind. There's no right answer on that one. That's something to keep in mind as you enter into relationships with major payers, because the minute you have a solution that works and does well, that question's going to come up. So.
Yeah, I would add, you know, your exit strategy is really going to inform like how much exclusivity you would allow, or how deeply you're going to integrate, or how modular you're going to stay. So it's really going to affect your product design and also your go-to-market strategy. And, you know, if your goal is to sell to a payer, then deep integration may make sense. If your goal is to go multi-payer, then you might want to be very careful of like exclusivity agreements or traps, things like that. So I would say thank you so much for joining us today. Everything we do at Acros is with the founder in mind. We want to help you build smarter. We want to help you build faster and better. And our goal is to get you access to experts like Tarek, and that are on the health plan side, that are the decision makers, to get you the latest insights into how to navigate the space and really get to success. So if you have any follow-up questions, let us know. And then again, we'll send out the recordings after this and slides. But keep us posted as you're navigating your go-to-market journey. We'd love to be a partner and to help you. So thanks for joining in.
Thanks, everybody.